The 20th century, unhappily, has seen some of the worst human rights abuse in history. We are now painfully aware in our brand new century that man's inhumanity to man seems to be both boundless and borderless. But the past century also saw a turning point in efforts to stop the terrible slaughter of men and women and children by making the perpetrators accountable under universal human rights laws. International criminal tribunals have been created by the world community to take moral responsibility where single nations have been unwilling or unable to take action themselves.
There is no doubt that justice will eventually lead to the equality of all human beings in every part of the globe.
How does one become a champion for human rights? If you're a white growing up a witness to apartheid in South Africa, it takes conscience and courage. For Richard Goldstone, these traits became apparent early. His life's mission took hold when he was still a university student over 40 years ago and was sick at heart to see the indignities that black South Africans were made to endure.
We were all equal on the campus, but the minute they stepped off the campus, they had to carry documents I didn't have to carry. They were forced to go to segregated black townships. Many of them had to study without electricity.
Richard Goldstone played a crucial role during South Africa's transition. When he accepted his first appointment as a judge in 1980, Goldstone faced a moral dilemma. His oath of office required him to uphold the laws of South Africa, but his sense of humanity saw injustice. Working within the system, he found ways to pierce the armor of apartheid. In 1989, as the apartheid government crumbled, Judge Goldstone was asked to take on a difficult challenge at a time of widespread bloodshed within his country. In an unprecedented act, Justice Goldstone began to visit prisoners detained without trial to hear their grievances and improve their conditions. The very first, Zwelakhe Sisulu. Both men remember it well.
When you go through the trauma of detention and torture, instinctively you know who are the good people and who are the bad people. It is simply human nature. So when I saw him first time, instinctively I knew, that this was a good person. This individual had integrity.
Sisulu was being kept in solitary confinement with a surveillance camera trained on him 24 hours a day. Goldstone heard his complaints, but was concerned that despite his own good intentions, he might himself be perceived as part of the problem.
So I said to him, now, I'd like some advice from you. And he put back his head and he's got a lovely, rich, deep laugh. And he said, this is Rich. He said, a Supreme Court judge asking a detainee for advice. And I said, no, I'm absolutely serious. And I told him what my problem was. And he didn't hesitate. He said, all I can tell you is I'm so pleased to see you. He said, please come back soon.
In the next 2.5 years, Goldstone visited more than 3,000 detainees, all being held without having committed any criminal offense. He got them magazines and clothing. He arranged for family visits.
This white man pitched up one day and I didn't know who he was, and he introduced himself and said he was Richard Goldstone. He's a judge and he's going around looking at the conditions of detainees, and asked me who I was and what I did, and I told him I'm a journalist. He went away and came back with about 30 National Geographics. I had never read a National Geographic in my whole life before, but when he left me with those, I sat there and started reading, and those National Geographics, it took me out of that cell. For the time that I was reading them, I was not in that cell, I was out there.
Goldstone began to raise the hopes of the oppressed. South Africa was changing. Zwelakhe Sisulu realized that the police state was collapsing upon itself, and that there were those finally in power who could be counted on as allies.
We understood that the demise of the South African state had to actually happen in an orderly way. And so this is why we actually welcomed, people like Judge Goldstone, that they should be on the bench because they understood our values. We could trust them, that they would be people who actually would usher in the new society.
Goldstone was named head of a commission whose task was to examine violence and intimidation in South Africa from all sides and to make the truth public.
Commissions are frequently referred to by the name of the person who heads it, but this really was the Goldstone Commission. He gave it a certain personality, a gravitas, a style. It picked up the most conflictual, the most tense, the most ravaging aspects of our life in a very turbulent part of South African history.
Goldstone believed that a forum for inquiry and testimony, a public airing of the crimes and horrors committed, would reduce tensions and help heal the nation. It is this belief in the cleansing power of making the truth public that has been central to his approach to human rights and international justice.
One thing I was very aware of, particularly during the Goldstone Commission, and that was that Richard was part of history. And I kept saying to our children, do you know that Daddy's name is going to be in the history books of this country for many years to come?
But Richard Goldstone's place in history was not to be limited to one country.
I declare open the International Tribunal for the prosecution of persons responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian law.
In 1994, he was asked to take on yet another challenge, to become chief prosecutor of the United Nations Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. It was an offer he wanted to refuse, for he had just been appointed a justice of South Africa's highest court and felt that he had a duty to serve. But President Mandela himself intervened, and it was arranged that Goldstone's seat in the court would be protected.
I also felt that it would be a good for South Africa if a man of his caliber went to The Hague.
Terrible crimes were being committed, and the war crimes tribunals were trying to do something unprecedented. Their judges did not represent the victorious nations, but rather the whole world community backed by the UN. It was an enormous undertaking, just getting underway. Richard Goldstone had to nourish what was little more than an idea when he first arrived.
Everything looked bleak at that moment, and so having somebody come from a situation where they had triumphed over such extraordinary odds, and having played such an important role in that triumph, was especially significant in inspiring hope that something would come of the tribunal.
What he had the wisdom to concentrate on was getting people to pay attention to us. He was tireless.
Goldstone gave the tribunals the impetus to build groundbreaking cases which furthered international criminal law with virtually every decision. Achievements included, in the case of the Rwanda tribunal, the first genocide conviction ever. The tribunal in The Hague served as a tangible influence on the termination of the conflict, which broke apart the former Yugoslavia, triggered the imprisonment of a head of state and chief architect of the wars in the Balkans, and the use of rape as a tool of war.
Until 1993, when the Yugoslavia tribunal was set up, we simply had no international courts at all, and political and military leaders intent on committing war crimes, committing genocide and crimes against humanity knew that as long as they stayed at home and were protected at home, there was no arm of the law anywhere in the world that could grab them.
Judge Goldstone believes it is essential that a permanent international criminal court be established now to look at the perpetrators of war crimes everywhere, and there are many who side with him.
It is absolutely necessary to have an international court of justice which is there to ensure that the terrible war crimes which have been committed, especially during the second half of the 20th century, are punished.
As we have so recently learned, Reacting with shock and horror to evil is natural, but eradicating it in the world is difficult. In our time, few have fought against it so steadfastly and effectively as Richard Goldstone, and few have earned such trust.
I think it's the set of his face, I think it's the way he speaks, I think it's everything about him that gives that impression that he's not going to rest until he gets the job done.
And he makes, I think, people in general feel that they can make a difference to make things better.
Each time I see him, I remember that encounter deep in the rural outback of South Africa when, in terms of my own resources as a person to keep myself together, I was probably reaching the lowest ebb, and he provided for me something that lifted me and gave me hope.
You know, there are people I can give my hand to, and I will be safe.